Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of TIGS. And I'm so glad to have you all here. We're going to get started on our first panel in just a couple of minutes, making sure everybody has managed to get into the Zoom call as we get started this morning. In the meantime, I'm quite looking forward to a full day today, which focuses more on our on the game design and game mechanics side and the community side. Yesterday, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about our industry, and now today we're going to talk about the rest. And I see we've got a couple of our folks here set up for, yep, we got everybody moving in. I think we'll just need someone to see. We're just waiting on one last panelist. Rami, I've been talking to him on the back end. As soon as he joins, we'll get you all started. I'm going to turn my video off, and I'm going to pass this to Renee and let you get started. And then as soon as we get Rami in on the Zoom itself, we'll move him over there for you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Eve. I'm really glad to be here today and that we're having this important panel as someone who has developed indie games for basically my entire career in game development. I think that talking about mental health, mental wellness in indie games is a really compelling subject, particularly because indie game developers face challenges that game developers at larger studios may not. I would like my panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves, just so we can understand their backgrounds, get a little bit more context for their responses. And David, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Is my mic working? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Dave Edery. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Spryfox. We started it back in February of 2010, so it's been just over 10 years. And before that, I was the worldwide portfolio manager of Xbox Live Arcade, which I guess doesn't exist anymore, but back then was a good place for indies.
Wonderful. Lazzie?
Hi, I'm Lazzie. I'm half of a tiny little studio called Arbitrary Metric with my colleague Jess. We booted up just in 2018, so super recent, and we shipped a game called Paratopic, which did better than we were expecting, which is really cool, and brings with it all of the joys of running a business. So we've kind of been, let's say, coping with that. And yeah, so I gave a talk last year on kind invitation to Game Happens in Genoa about mental health. And I found it was a really powerful experience, just being able to kind of share and be really vulnerable in a space that was built for it, which is all credit to the organizers for making that possible. It was an amazing event. And I cited IGDA and Take This, the white paper on State of the Industry. I got in touch with Eve. She liked it, and so here I am. And yeah, that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Rami, want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I am Rami Ismail. I am formerly one half of Dutch independent studio of Lambert. I'm an industry ambassador, fly around the world, trying to help developers everywhere get access to the same resources and benefits we have in the Western world and more established parts of the games industry. And I make tools for independent developers.
Wonderful, glad to have you. And I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm Renee Gittins. I'm the executive director of the International Game Developers Association, the IGDA. I actually run a small indie studio on the side, Stumbling Cat, which is we're working on a game called Potions: A Curious Tale. So there are a number of topics that I'm hoping that we can dive into in our time here today. The first that I wanted to talk about is the feelings that both success and failure bring as a indie developer. I feel like when you are much more in charge of a project and much more dependent on it, both can have more extreme effects. So success often means that future failures can feel or be seen as more significant. Have you felt that your successes have caused additional pressures?
Want to take this one? Shall I go for it?
Yeah. Let's just have an open discussion.
Yeah, sure.
Everything should just be casual here.
Yeah, cool. I think certainly. When I walked into an accountant's office for the first time in mid-December, I kind of said, well, first I had to have the elevator pitch down, which of course is a huge part of this gig as well. And I said, you know, we don't see ourselves as business people. First and foremost, we see ourselves as creatives. And so help us out of this mess. And the mess is still ongoing. But this is all, you know, this is all subsequent to, you know, by any measure, a success. And we initially just planned to kind of make rent with a little game. But it struck a chord, and it's really difficult to complain. Some days you do find yourself cursing it though. It's once we're like, okay, well, we're gonna have to incorporate. That's step one, and there's loads of paperwork. And then once the tax all catches up with you, because that's kind of like a year or two in arrears, depending on how you run it, then it all just the severity of the documents that you've signed kind of really comes home to roost. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I can find myself in that. I've always wanted to be a programmer, right? Since I was 6, I've been programming video games, and I've always had my goal to be somebody who writes code for video games. And then Vlambeer started, and between me and my co-founder, I was better equipped to do the business part of it. So I just ended up doing that and the marketing. And then before you know it, Vlambeer had become a real thing. And I think for me, some of the biggest challenges have not been so much the logistics of running a company. I think my programmer mindset kind of worked me around like structures and, you know, like systems like that. It was actually a lot of the softer skills that really were rough on me. Like now suddenly I was a public figure, right? People cared about my opinion, which is terrifying because nobody ever cared at all about what I thought. But now I have to balance what I'm saying with the people I'm reaching. I have to be careful of hurting people that I don't even know or harming their work through systems I'm not aware of. And as Lazzie was saying, one of the things that is a weird contradiction in this is that you can't really complain about it because things are good. Like genuinely things are just pretty good in your life. Like in my situation, we had revenue, we had fans, we had a consistent like venue to release our games to. But obviously that doesn't remove the sort of like mental strain that you go through making games. And it becomes harder to find people to talk to as well because you don't want to complain. So creating that sort of social network was a half a decade challenge in my case, to just find people where I could be like, hey, listen, we're really successful and I'm sad, like help. So yeah, for that, it's a strange situation to be in. And because things have gone this way for me, it's also really hard for me to, like, I don't know what the other side feels like because Vlambeer went so fast and it has sort of been on the up all the time. And it feels really bad to complain or to feel like I'm complaining. And that has actually been pretty dangerous to my mental health at time, I would guess. Just the feeling that I can't talk about it.
Right.
For us, we've had, I guess we definitely had sort of an extreme start where it was, you know, a very small group. And then right off the bat, we made a couple of games that were very successful by indie standards, Tripletown being sort of the best known. And because it wasn't just one, it was two. It was like Tripletown and Realm of the Mad God within a relatively short period of time. And even the things that we had a couple of super ultra small projects that didn't do great, but still ended up at least breaking even. So we were like, oh, cool, we can do no wrong, right? Like this is going to go on forever, which is a thing that I'd like to think we wouldn't have fooled ourselves into thinking had it just been one game. But the fact that like multiple games came out and all did fine, we were like, oh, great, this is going to be easy going forward. And having talked to other folks who had similar experiences, that's a fairly common failing, where people are like, oh, okay, my last two or three things did fine, so the next things should all do at least fine as well. So then when we had our first project that didn't actually do well, lost more money than it made, we were kind of caught flat-footed. Like we had allowed ourselves to think that everything was going to be at least break even going forward, or maybe it's just a small success. The idea that we could lose most of our money on making a game was not really a thing. Like we sort of intellectually understood that was a possibility, but emotionally had discounted it to the point where it was dangerous. And that's tough, right? And I think one thing that I think that we knew intellectually, but hadn't really taken to heart emotionally, was that this industry changes so much over such short periods of time that even if you feel like you've locked in a formula that works, that there's good reason to believe that within 2 to 3 years that formula will be completely irrelevant. In the 10 years that I've been in this industry, we've seen Facebook games basically come and go. I mean, they still exist, but they're obviously a shadow of their former selves. Web games became huge and then kind of shrank, and then now maybe are growing again. It's unclear. Xbox Live Arcade was a thing and then not a thing. Steam was a paradise for indies and then suddenly overcrowded just like everything else. Mobile came, and then became overcrowded just like everything else. I'm sure I'm forgetting at least 2 or 3 other, like VR, big burst. And then, I mean, think about that. That's 10 years. That's crazy. And I'm not even naming everything. So it's super free to play, obviously, was not really much of a thing in the West 10 years ago, and then suddenly is a huge thing. The sheer amount of change in 10 years, I don't think any industry, like I'm hard pressed to think of a single industry that can come anywhere close to matching us. So I guess the reason I'm harping on that so much is because I think as an independent developer, it's really, really important that you recognize, gosh, just how much things can change, and just, how much turbulence that can bring to your life and how uncertain everything is. And then as a result, like, to be two things: to be kind to yourself when things don't go the way you expect, because I mean, how could you possibly know what to expect in an industry as wild as ours? And then the second thing is to not fall into the trap of, and this is super common, people are like, oh, you have a successful game. Take every single penny you made from that successful game and invest it in the next one, which thankfully is something we didn't do, because had we done it, we would not be here today. We would have absolutely gone out of business years ago. And that's a thing that you see a lot of successful indies do. They'll basically invest everything they made from their first successful game into the next one, and it's a tragedy, right? Because 9 times out of 10 that doesn't work out.
Doubling down is super tempting, particularly when you've seen an audience just appear out of nowhere as well. It's like, oh, well, how could we, like, anything we give them, they're going to love. And it's not even necessarily whether people love it or hate it, but the stakes are in some ways a lot higher on the second title. I mean, we shipped a second game in October last year on Humble, and we sort of weren't totally happy with it. And it's just because it turned out the production of the first one and parts of the structure of the first one, it turned out that really aligned with our skills. And on this other thing, it didn't. And and so we're not super happy with the product. And it's like, okay, we managed to mitigate the risk of it. And thankfully, the first one's kind of been able to carry us through. But that's the kind of decision that you take thinking you've got your eyes open, and you kind of don't.
So you both had successful games, or a string of successful games, before having one that didn't end up working out quite as you expected. Did you feel, did that affect you? Did that affect you emotionally? Did you have a hard time adjusting to that?
I mean,
Oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Dave. Okay, I'll do it. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it came at the end of a period of crazy crunch for the two of us as well, because we'd kind of, I don't know if we'd partially overscoped. I think we tried to make it kind of a little too involved, a little too thematic, and so we were doing a lot of revisions and going back and forth on things, and it kept pushing the ship date back. And so we were kind of in this cycle of like 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. It was a bizarre time. And so when it shipped, frankly, we were just so glad to see the back of it. But we hope to do something with it in future. But it's certainly, I mean, by the end of that, we were completely exhausted. And I think in some ways, we're still sort of recovering from that energy outlay. But in terms of the reception, I mean, humble originals are, if you kind of just let them sit and don't ship them elsewhere, it's sort of a little bit of a walled garden. So in some ways, it was quite contained, the reception, and we still have some control over the optics moving forward. But yeah, it was difficult.
Yeah. It was tough. I mean, the first couple of games that did significantly worse than we expected, we forced us to basically, again, like we had intellectually understood what the probabilities were, but emotionally we kind of discarded that important understanding. And so after that first couple that didn't go the way we expected, we had to go through a process of like just basically completely tossing out certain erroneous assumptions we'd made and about what our future could look like and how many risks we could take and what sort of behavior was appropriate for us as a studio, and like rethink all that. And I think that process was sort of hard. It's hard on the ego, and it's emotionally it's draining. And then at the same time, I consider us very lucky because again, we at least hadn't doubled down and spent every penny we had, and so we could go through that process and we could come out the other side stronger. And that was good, but it was tough. I mean, we literally changed almost everything about the company in some ways. Like up until that point, we had been focused mainly on working with friends in the industry as sort of like co-development partners, and we completely shifted around, gosh, I don't know, I guess it would have been around 2014, to more of a model of like, we're going to have like full-time team members and they're going to be part of Spryfox, and it's not going to be like these collaborations with other companies, because it turns out those are much harder than we realized they are. And there was just a bunch of like, that's just one example, but there were a lot of examples about how we just sort of had to completely rethink the way the company committed itself to certain projects, and that was like a big deal. And I mean, I think it worked out, but because we're still here 10 years later, but it was quite trying. And I don't even know what would have happened had we not had, I mean, we ended up being fortunate. We released Alpha Bear in, I guess that was 2015, and that ended up doing really well. And so it was like, oh, cool, okay, we can do this. We weren't just lucky in the first couple of years, and now we can't do it anymore. But who knows? There was no guarantee that something like that would happen. Maybe there's an alternate timeline where that didn't happen, and I can imagine in that alternate timeline we would have been super duper duper ultra stressed out and depressed. So these things are hard.
Right. Well, do any of you have advice when it comes to letting go of those assumptions and potentially even letting go of projects that aren't going in the right direction? Knowing when to stop poking at them, right?
I mean, I think at Vlambeer, honestly, we've killed more projects than we've completed. Like it's a very common thing. The final thing that Vlambeer released before we shut down the studio on September 1st this year was a prototype that we've been working on since 2010 when we were founded. It was supposed to be our second game, and we genuinely tried making that game 6 or 7 times over the course of our company. And now we just finally released the prototype because studio wrapped up, and it's actually it's a really strange place to be, to just have given up on that project, because we just couldn't. We knew there was something there. It just turns out we're not the right people to bring it out. I think over the years, two of the most valuable sort of powers that we've gained, that we've trained ourselves, is we got really good at recognizing when me and JW at the time, my co-founder, were excited about something, which is it's a weird thing to lock down because it's really easy to just have a level of excitement for anything creative you're working on. It turns out that me and him had very different ways of reacting to that. He would go and start prototyping right away. I would lean back in my chair and start like thinking and like figuring out how the meta of that would look and how that would feel and how that would work out. Locking that down, getting a sense of how my brain responds to certain things was a huge part of becoming a better game developer and becoming a healthier human as well. Because for the start, we just kind of did whatever, right? Like, because kind of similar to what David was saying, like everything just rolled. It was momentum. There was such a sense of momentum. And it's so easy to get swept up in that. And for us, the first thing that went wrong was not a failed game or a game that didn't launch well. It was a cloned game. We were working on a game and a different studio stole the game idea, released that game before we could, and made millions of dollars. Like clearly we had been sitting on a good idea, just somebody else got to, make it. And honestly, same thing. We were, same thing Lazzie was saying, honestly. I think everybody kind of goes through these motions at some point in their, or at least in certain parts, in certain generations of sort of indie games over the last decade, the same sort of pattern emerges, right? Everybody's trying and failing until it works. And when it works, you get the sense of momentum, you get swept up in it, and then you hit the wall of reality. And depending on how much momentum you got to build, that wall hurts more or less, right? If you have a little bit of momentum, you might still have a part of you that was like, oh yeah, well, the first game was a success. Second game, we didn't know if it was going to work out. But then you do 2 games or 3 games or 4 games, and things are working out, and then the wall hits. For us, we crunched through 3 games, which destroyed us, but we were not aware of it because the momentum felt good. And then our 4th game was a disaster. It eventually launched super well, but when that clone hit, the only reason Vlambeer survived as a studio is because a small Canadian indie team reached out to us. They had been cloned before, and they said, hey, if there's anything we can do to help, let us know. And we said, well, are you good at mobile development? And they're like, yeah. We're like, can you port Super Crate Box, which was our debut game? And they did that. We split the revenue for that. That was the only money that kept Vlambeer alive. Without that, we would have been out of business in 2013. Like, we owe everything to that tiny indie studio in Canada.
It's kind of crazy coming that close to the edge, isn't it? I mean, presumably, just like in terms of on like killing projects, presumably you don't see Vlambeer as a failed project at this point, but it is completed, and that's, for better or worse, that's one of the things that is cool about this sector, is we kind of get to be agile potentially. I mean, it's not completely trivial to just set up a whole new company. If you just just forget about the last one, like who me? It doesn't quite work like that. But how do you feel having kind of closed the gestalt on that last period?
It was a decade of my life, and I think it's strange because we knew it was coming. Like, Vlambeer was never meant to be eternal. It was created out of necessity. Me and JW both dropped out of university, and we just needed a way to earn money. And he was good at starting games. I was good at wrapping them up. So together, it really quickly formed into, okay, we'll do 1 or 2 games until we have enough, life or experience or money or whatever thing comes out of this to maybe make a career. And then 10 years later, it's turned into your full identity. Like, most people think of me as Rami from Vlambeer rather than Rami Ismail, right? Like that, it's become who I am. And I think for both me and JW, the feeling of getting to be ourselves is really appealing. Like, we're absolutely in sort of a luxury position where we could shut down the thing that we've depended on for a decade. But it's a weird mix of nostalgia for a time that no longer exists, right? Like, the part of me wants to be back in 2010 when iOS was just like a new thing and Flash games were still there, and we were just like working ridiculous hours to make weird creative stuff where we didn't understand the risk or scope of what we were doing, part of me wants to go back, and part of me is like, thank God I'm not doing that ever again, right? Like because it was bad, it was genuinely bad for us, but a weird part of your brain always romanticizes those things, and it's hard to fight it. It's surprisingly difficult to find that, I don't know what it is, like this urge to just create without any sense of stake or failure, or just
Maybe you can
make
do
stuff.
that now.
Maybe, but if I'm going to do that, I think the 10 years of experience I've had have taught me how not to do that as well. And I think that
You gotta unlearn it. Yeah.
the scary part about that is I think that every journey is just so different. But we kind of end up with the same lessons, which is weird, because you can't say like, oh, just do this, this, and this, and you'll be fine, right? Like your mental health will be fine, your financials will be fine, your games will be fine. But we can kind of say like, okay, don't do these things because they will screw you over, right? But I think the other part of me that has been traveling around the year and been doing all this public speaking, I've kind of learned that doesn't necessarily, like I can tell 1,000 developers, please don't do these things, and they're going to do it anyway. We're a bunch of super stubborn, creative, like just we believe we can do it the right way. Because I've been warned. When I started, people definitely warned me, don't crunch, don't work ridiculous hours, go to bed at a good time, shower at your game jams, like, you know, all of these things. And then I can guarantee you that a lot of those advices, I was like, nah, we're good. And now I'm the same person giving those advices, but I don't know, maybe it's a lack of structural history in our industry. Maybe it's just things shift too fast, but.
Most people have to learn things the hard way. It's really hard.
Yeah.
I actually, I want to go back to Renee, to your question in a second. But before I do, since this is a good moment, a quick anecdote. I remember going to a GDC presentation of a really good friend of mine, super knowledgeable person, Emily Greer, and she was talking about multiplayer in free-to-play mobile games. And my partner Daniel and I were in the audience together, and she said something about how asynchronous multiplayer modes were like really important to the game and would make it a lot more successful. And so both of us were furiously writing notes about this. And then at the end of the session, I went up to Emily and I was like, "Wow, thank you so much. This was incredibly helpful. You know, we hadn't really considered that, you know, turn-based multiplayer, you know, could make such a big difference, and you know, been sort of discounting it. We're not going to invest in that." And she said, "Whoa, what are you talking about with turn-based? When I said asynchronous, I meant like you playing against a bot that's controlling the account of a human player in real time." And I was like, that's not my definition of asynchronous multiplayer. And I mean, literally, like I had completely and utterly misunderstood one of the central points of her lectures. And like, that's just one of maybe a dozen cases I can think of where someone was trying to give me advice and I had no conception of the advice that I was being given. And I mean, those are obviously extreme cases, but yeah, it's really hard to give advice, which is one of the reasons why I actually get nervous every time I participate in a panel like this one or a lecture, because I'm always paranoid about who's going to misunderstand what I'm saying. If anyone in the audience does hear something I'm saying and has a strong reaction to it and wants to message me later to make sure that they understood or not, please feel free. Anyway, so to briefly go back to your original question, Renee, about like what can you how do you know when it's time to stop working on a game? I think it was really good to hear Rami say like we cut a lot of games. I think people who maybe haven't been doing development as long as the rest of us maybe don't always realize how many games we kill before we release one. It's really hard to know when to kill a game. It's actually one of the single biggest challenges, and I'm not going to pretend for a second that we're great at that. Like, there are definitely a number of projects that we let go on for far too long and should have been killed earlier. All I can say, and again, this unfortunately I can't give like sort of like standard rules that apply to everyone. The rules are going to depend on what you're making and how big your studio is and a bunch of other stuff. But having a set of rules that make sense for your studio, given what you're trying to make and who you are, about when you kill something is really, really, really important. Like, just to give you an example, in the early days of Spry Fox had a rule that was like, within a month of working on it, a game needed to be fun for at least a few minutes to play. Like if it wasn't fun for at least a few minutes to play after an entire month of development, it probably wasn't worth continuing to work on. And then by 3 months, it needed to be fun for at least like half an hour or whatever, half an hour, depending on the project. And if it wasn't fun for that much time by that mark, you really should probably kill the project and move on.
Do you feel like these rules help separate the emotional attachment to like the idea of the project and made it easier to cut it off if necessary?
Yeah, because the thing is that if you don't have rules like that, then, and by the way, this is going to be a kind of a funny comparison. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone make this comparison, but it's fresh in my mind right now, given the craziness of the stock market. Like you'll hear from investment advisors over and over and over and over and over again. Like this is advice they give to everyone, rich people, poor people, whatever. If you're putting money in the stock market, have it diversified in a certain way and then never look at it again. Like pretend it doesn't exist. Don't care what the market is doing from day to day. Just pretend it doesn't exist. And the reason, I know this sounds a little, it's like, why is he talking about this? I'll get to it. The reason they give you that advice is because the vast majority of people, I mean, basically everyone who doesn't get really lucky, when they try to react, like when they allow their emotions to get in their way and they try to react to what's happening in the stock market, they inevitably end up making less money than they would have otherwise, or even losing money. Like everyone thinks they can time the market and nobody actually can. Like even the people who get paid billions of dollars to time the market tend to underperform the average indexes, right? So like the best advice an advisor can give you is like put your money in diversified, things like, some of it's in stocks, some of it's in bonds, some of it's in whatever, and then just ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist. So the reason they're telling you that is because they know that if you follow your emotions, you're going to get screwed. It's the same here. Like if you simply allow yourself to be emotional about a project that you're working on, there's a really, really good chance that you're going to end up screwing yourself, right? Because it's so easy to find excuses to keep working on something that isn't working out. You'll have like 5 friends play it, and 3 or 4 of them will be totally bored. But one of them will be like, yeah, this was kind of cool. I enjoyed it. And you're like, aha, there's that spark. And you chase that spark because 1 in 5 of your friends was nice enough to say so, you know what I mean? Like, and you're just grasping at straws. You're like, oh, cool, he liked it. Okay, I just have to chase that. I just have to work on that a little bit more. There's a million things like that that can cause you to run after something that isn't working out. And so having these hard and fast rules, most of the people who play it have to be able to have fun for at least 5 minutes at the 1 month mark or whatever, right? Like, again, the specific rule is going to change depending on the team and the project, but having those rules will protect you from yourself. It'll prevent you from falling into the logical fallacies that all human beings do. Like, it doesn't matter how good you are. I like to think at this point, I've been doing this for 10 years, I'm theoretically pretty good at it. I still fall for these problems. Like, and I've been doing this a really, really long time. There's very, very low likelihood that anyone who's listening to this panel online is the kind of person who can just subjectively at all times make wise decisions about what they should cut and what they should not cut. Like, you need to have some rules that you force yourself to follow. Usually, most studios that I know that are functional have those rules.
We had 48 hours to make it fun, and then 2 weeks to see if we were still having fun making it. That was our rules. We kept to that, and we kept to that. Sorry?
48 hours is what we call a rapid prototype.
Yeah, that's what Vlambeer was. That was what our studio was, right? Like, we were a studio that made very small games that focused around the feeling of a core mechanic. So if we couldn't get that ready in 48 hours, we weren't going to get the game done. Like, it was just not who we were. If I was a studio working on real-time strategy games, that rule would be awful because there would never be a game launched, right? You can't make an RTS work in 48 hours, as far as I know. So it's just who you are, how you work, how you talk, how you communicate.
This is like the company culture part of the indie thing, right? Because obviously more corporate, bigger companies tend to have a kind of charter or something, often to do with HR. But we have our internal cultures as well, and that's it's really important.
It's something I think a lot of indies are unaware of until they ever have to start hiring, which is kind of terrifying. That people are just completely and utterly unaware of the fact that they have formed a culture, and that culture has both positive and negative effects on the people, on who they are, but also how they interact with others.
Yeah, and then how do you bring people into that? Is a really, I mean, I like you were saying about soft skills. That's not intuitive a lot of the time to kind of sell the day-to-day experience to someone and how you work and how, like, what place humor has and what place stupid ideas have and how you use your tools and all of that stuff. You know, there's so much to it. Yeah.
I think. Go
Sorry.
ahead.
One of the things so I help a lot of indies, like I consult for a lot of indies or just help them out when they have issues. And one of the most common problems I am faced with talking to indies is they have just released a successful first game. And now it turns out that the people that formed that studio during that project or because of that project, now they have to come up with a second project. And suddenly they don't agree anymore. And they've never had that situation before where they have to make this big call, there's suddenly stakes and they're disagreeing about it. And I've seen this in studios, like tiny studios that are like 2 people. I've seen the studios that are releasing major indie games right now. Just like, how do you deal with disagreement? How do you deal with stakes? How do you deal with follow-ups? How do you deal with the emotional load of suddenly being in charge of a real thing? People don't talk about these things until they're necessary. And technically that's too late, right? Technically, now you're already at the point where there's friction, and friction makes it harder to talk to people. And I think I got super lucky with that in that we just had very clear distinctions. JW was in charge of design and I was in charge of business and programming. So he made the calls about designs and I said, well, that is probably not going to work, or that is going to work. But yeah, the teams of like 4 or 6, a lot of like game jam started teams, they run into those problems at some time. And I think it would actually be a really good exercise for a lot of indies to just write down like, okay, here's how we talk about difficult things, even when there haven't really been difficult things yet. I think that would be super helpful just from my experience talking to indies.
So a common theme that I've noticed for this discussion so far is introspection, reflecting on, what your internal culture is, or if you are delusional about the potential success for a project. And one part of our mental state that I see, particularly in the game industry and indie developers, when it comes to having a hard time with introspection, is the ever famous imposter syndrome, and being unable to look inwards and see why you have value and why you are successful and why you should be where you are. Have any of you had experiences with imposter syndrome?
Yeah, sure. I mean, anytime we put out a game that doesn't do as well as we'd hoped, which has happened a few times, where you can't help but start to feel like, maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I'm not doing, maybe I'm not doing what I should. Maybe I'm not doing as well as I should. And it's interesting, actually. I'm lucky. It is, like Rami said, it took years, but eventually I sort of had my crowd of fellow folks in the industry who I could go to for advice and stuff like that. And some of the people in that circle are like literally famous and success, very, very successful, certainly more than we are. And almost every single one of them has at some point or another copped to like severe imposter syndrome. It's amazing. Like people who you would never guess will be like, oh yeah, like, we sort of spent the last year lost in the woods on this game. It's not going the direction and we're all doubting ourselves and, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And it's like, oh my gosh, if you think that, and so I think it's like super, super common, and people should, again, just be kind to themselves when they're having those emotions, because they're in really good company. I suspect the only people who don't feel imposter syndrome every once in a while in the industry, I mean, assuming they've been in it long enough to have experiences that would cause it, which almost all of us do. I think anyone who doesn't have those feelings is probably some sort of sociopath, you know what I mean? Because virtually everyone I know has had the feelings. I don't know what kind of person you'd have to be to not have them.
Absolutely. And I feel like you don't even need a large success to get imposter syndrome. Just anything can cause that.
I mean, at the core of that is that what we're doing is subjective. There's just no way to go like, oh, this game is a 7 out of 10. You did pretty well. Like that's just not how it works. You can't grade yourself according to the, Supergiant scale of indie games. Like it's just not like, oh, game is like a 4 out of 10 on the Supergiant scale and a 6 out of 10 on the Capybara scale. Like that's just not. You make a thing. And then the response you get is the response you're getting. And you can't be like, well, we did this. You can be proud of things, But in general, I think I've given 1,000 talks in my life across the entire globe. I start every talk with the same sentence because I am terrified every time I get on a stage that I'm going to mess it up. Like, I start every talk I've ever done with, "Hi, my name is Rami Ismail. I'm one half of Dutch Independent Studio of Lambeer." I now have to change that line. You know how much stress this has been giving me, like over the past month and a half, that I'm just
To
like,
rethink the whole thing, yeah.
and that, like, Lily, that for me, that has been like a mental switch that I taught myself to just stop worrying about it. Just be on the stage, say the things you believe, and then we'll deal with the rest afterwards, right? Like, we'll listen to the feedback and adjust the talk accordingly. But the same thing is true for games. Like, you have these things that you truly, genuinely believe. You put your heart in it, right? You're a creative at heart, even if you're doing the business. Even if we're talking about stock markets and, like, company culture and closing down a studio, like, at the heart, we just want to make nice things, like beautiful things that make people happy. And then you sit there and you release a thing, and of course you're terrified. This is your baby. This is a thing that you care about, and you don't know. It's terrifying. And halfway through, of course, there's things that go wrong in a development for every game. So you sit there and you're like, if only I was a better game developer, I would not be in this mess, right? Like, clearly everybody else has figured this out, because I listen to GDC talks and they're just super confident about, oh, they did this, this, and this. We are very good as an industry about talking about the things that went right. And we are awful about the things that went wrong, because either you don't hear those people because they didn't have a success, or because we just don't like talking about those things as much. Like, we've projected this image of how do you make a AAA game, and it's just this one shot of somebody in a motion capture suit, and then like a second video with the dots on the screen, and the third video is like the fully textured 3D model with proper light and everything. Like, of course we're terrified. Like, it looks that easy. How is it that hard for us?
How do you draw a face? First, draw a circle, and then draw the rest of the face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you're done.
Unfortunately, the only people who get to talk about failure at a place like GDC are the people who, like, either were very successful before that failure or somehow very successful after that failure. And you never hear from what are literally the majority of game developers who just always failed. And that's that, right? And that's a hard thing for people who are trying to break in, or trying, or have broken in but haven't yet had, their success that's going to carry them forward. Like, they look and they feel like, oh gosh, I'm a failure because I've been doing this for however many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many years without having to hit, not realizing that they're in really good company. Probably 80-90% of developers are in their bucket. So it's kind of important. It's important to understand that. It's also really important to understand that survival bias is probably the #1 thing that drives these kind of lectures. And so, I mean, in general, the game industry is like any entertainment business, right? Whether it's movies or television, but particularly even more so in games, because even like a single person can make a game and put it out there on Steam, right? So you have literally thousands of basement garage companies trying to do that every year, and most of them silently failing without anyone knowing about it. And oops, I should have turned off my phone before this. And it's really one of those things where they're all, all that failure is happening silently. You're not hearing about it. You're not reading about it. You're only finding it out about you're basically hearing from the 1% to 3%, whatever the percentage is, right? It's a tiny single-digit percentage who've been successful, and you don't actually know what percentage of that percentage got successful because they were in the right place at the right time. But I'm here to tell you, it was almost all of them, right? Like, almost all of them became successful because they were in the right place at the right time. It's not that they weren't also good and they tried really hard and they put all their all into it. They probably did all that, but that wouldn't have mattered had they not also been at the right place at the right time. I know countless stories of people making fantastic games, but they just happened to release that game 1 year after the market window for that game closed. They were working on it for a little bit too long, and that space is crowded now, and they've released the best possible, Clash of Clans style game, but it's 2 years after 500 other Clash of Clans clones came out, and that window's gone, and they can't succeed anymore, regardless of how good their game is. So,
or even 2 years too early, right? Like the biggest failure we're talking about right now is the failed game of 2 years ago, which is Among Us, right? Like everybody's talking about Among Us. That game was by all measures a failure until recently, when suddenly it was not. It's just the right time, right place, right circumstances. And it is funny that we're now discussing the failure of Among Us and the eventual success, even though I guess by all standards you can call it a success at this point. And those are the failure stories we hear about, right? It's like, oh well, it worked out eventually. No, it doesn't for 99% of games.
Yeah.
It's the perfect illustration of the point, though. Yeah, absolutely. Just if I could just speak to the imposter syndrome thing a little bit. Given that our first game was the one that went big, it's not only the first game for the studio either. It's the first game that any of the people on the team actually shipped. That ended up leaving, I think, all of us with a different lived experience of imposter syndrome, but a pretty serious case of it. I mean, one of the so we found out in January. So we shipped the game in March 2018. We put it out, and that was on itch, which is amazing, as we all know. I hope we all know. And then we put it on Steam in September with some additions. And then in January 2019, we found out we'd been nominated for a couple categories at the IGFs, which obviously it's like, okay, I'm going to California, baby. Like, here we go. And that in and of itself was bizarre, because then suddenly that's, my first conference, first time on the West Coast, first nomination, like first time exhibiting, first game, first time meeting my colleagues in person. Holy, what is happening to David? That's incredible. Geez, distracted. So that was insane.
Sorry,
And
that's
then
the D filter that I have on, and I don't know why it just went on just now, but
it's totally fine. I loved it. But then having actually won one of those categories as well, I found where it hit the most substantially was when we came home, or when I came home, and we all went our separate ways. Like, I haven't met my colleagues before or since that week in SF. When I was waiting for the award to arrive, I was like, did any of that just happen? Did I just make all of that up in my head? I feel like I kind of like departed one life, got on a long haul flight, had another one for a week, and then came back and I was like, there's no sign of it. There's no sign of it. I just have this exhibition pass. And that was seriously challenging. I talked a lot in therapy about that period, and it's another one of those cases, obviously, where it's like, you're complaining, huh? But it was very difficult. And then moving forward from there, you've kind of got to go, okay, well, I didn't do this gunning for that result. That wasn't my goal. So what is my goal now? Well, like, where do I shoot for now? And the only thing I've been able to conclude is that I'm in it for the art, right? But that was a pretty acute case. And I actually thought it might be remedied a little bit by going back to the conference the following year. That didn't happen. And I think actually that's just on that. I think I feel particularly bad for nominees at the IGFs this year and winners who didn't get to go. I was speaking to one of them, Julian, who's making Promesa, which is an awesome game, who I met at Game Happens. And I had to kind of convince him, you should put that on your store page. And he's like, really? Yeah. I'm like, it's kind of a big deal, dude. Because it just didn't, it kind of didn't click. Because when you're there, when you meet everybody, when you run the expo floor, you're there on that pavilion, it's kind of hard to miss the significance of what's going on, and particularly when you go to the ceremonies and the party and stuff. But they just had kind of like an online awards ceremony, and they didn't get the opportunity to go out there and meet people and show their game off. So I don't know. I just think they will be struggling with that even more so now, because it's kind of like, even as illusory and weird as that whole process is, it's even more so in 2020, which is just completely bizarre.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we really have to keep in mind is that our industry and our creative field are two things that are continuously at odds with each other. Like, we are creatives that want to make things, and we are business people that want to sell things, and those are two separate parts of our identity that are continuously fighting. And no matter on what side you're succeeding or failing, like, there will always be that tension, and that tension is okay to have, right? Like, that feeling is fine. I've done this for a decade. It never went away. The sense of ego that comes with creating stuff, or the sense of pride that comes with creating stuff, being at odds with the financial results of a game, that's fine. You can be proud of a game that wasn't successful. You could have made something that you genuinely believe was beautiful art, and you're just happy that you made it, but also it made you $0. You can also be really upset at a game being successful. Like, I know people that made a game that were like, I'm just making this tiny thing, I don't really want people to care about it. And then suddenly it was the biggest thing in the world, and now they had to care about maintaining it. There's no right way of doing this. There's no wrong way of doing this. You are a human that feels things in response to these sometimes massive forces on your life and on your work and on your creativity. And you will have to, at some point, deal with it or reckon with it, independent of who you are or what you're trying to do here. Like, games are, if you are committed to making video games, you care about video games. There's just not there's not a good reason to be in video games if you just don't care about video games, as far as I know. So if that is true, then it matters. And if it matters, it can hurt you, which means you have to just keep being aware of what you're putting yourself through, what you're putting your body through, what you're putting your mind through, and be okay with talking about it. Like, be okay with reaching out for help. Be okay with being vulnerable with people you trust. Be okay with just tuning out for a bit. Like, after Nuclear Throne, I was exhausted. I tuned out of game development for a year, together with my co-founder. We were just like, okay, you know what? This game is doing well enough that if we just do nothing for a year, we might be okay. We didn't know if we would be, but we took the gamble, because the alternative was worse. No story will be the same, but everybody will at some point have a hard time in games. And for some people will have a hard time most of their time in games. It's all valid. It's all.
I'm glad you said the thing of what you said about the tension between financial outcomes and creative outcomes, and because I think obviously that's an issue in some ways more now than ever before, right? Now that more and more developers are trying to make free-to-play games where the business concerns are literally ingrained into the design concerns in a way that they've never been before, that's really, really hard. And I know a lot of developers who struggle, who want to go into that space, who struggle with that specifically. But even if you're not making a free-to-play game, it can be really hard where you're like, oh, I really want to do this thing in the game. Like, I want to make, for example, a political statement, or but I'm afraid that if I do that, the sales will be worse. And like, and then, well, how do you balance that? How do you balance your desire to make a political statement with your desire to be able to feed your family? Like, these are non-trivial issues. And one thing that honestly makes me a little bit sad about this industry, it's one of the only things with this industry that I don't like, is that precisely because it's comprised, almost entirely of a very large, very passionate group of people, there's a lot of judgment that happens in our industry. A lot of, like, particularly like on Twitter, like, you just, people constantly, passing judgment on other developers, what they're doing, how they're doing it. And I cannot say clearly enough that please just ignore that. Like, you're doing this for you. Nobody makes games. Sorry, that's not true. Very few people make games because they think it's going to make them rich. And those people who are making games because they think it's going to make it rich don't tend to be around for very long, with a few, again, notable exceptions. Most people are doing it because they love it. If you're making games, you're probably doing it because you love it, or at least want to love it. And I strongly encourage you to ignore what other people are saying about whether you're making the right or wrong decisions when it comes to your own creative product, right? Like, I mean, listen to them if they're telling you the game's not fun, because if you don't listen to them, you're in a lot of trouble. But like insofar as making a statement you want to make, or making trade-offs that you feel like you need to make so that the game can actually make money, like, that's your choice, and nobody has a right to tell you whether that choice is right or not. So I hope anyone listening to this remembers that.
So that leads well into one of the questions from our audience, that about the issue of a crowded marketplace and discoverability. As you're working on a game that is the game that you want to make, how do you deal with trying to make your game discoverable and stand out?
This is almost a technical question, right? It's like the marketing side of it is kind of a black art that speaking for myself, we've very much just been feeling our way through. My colleague Jess seems to have some sort of preternatural ability for what will actually gain traction versus what won't. And a lot of it comes down to stuff as simple as like understanding algorithms on Twitter and like what people engage with, and how best to frame a tweet and when to send it, and like how much traction will you gain by adding hashtags versus lose engagement by looking lame in doing so. It's a really, really difficult one. But in terms of positioning in the marketplace, I mean, it all depends on what stage your business is at, because there's, and this cuts across industries, but the marketing formalism really is understanding the different sectors of your audience, right? So you've got your kind of cold, quote unquote, cold contacts, which are people who've literally like never heard of your studio, never heard of your game. And then you've got the people who have heard of you, are maybe interested, were warm, and you've got people who have previously bought your products, are signed up to your mailing list, whatnot. So gauging the relative positions of all of those is crucial. But when it comes to an oversaturated market, I mean, this has been key for a lot of people shouting about indie apocalypse for years, right? That there's just a point where there's kind of like critical mass that we just can't come back from somehow. It seems not to have happened. It's hard to say how much of that is just because everybody's locked in their own homes at the moment, and so we're seeing like a bit of a boom period. I don't know, but yeah, I can't really speak too much on this because I just simply don't have that much experience. We were lucky.
I can say a few things. I have pretty strong opinions about this. I think, by the way, this is one of the curses of being in the game industry. Like, this panel could literally be about like, what color paint do you choose to color your house? And like the topic of like, how do you get visibility for your game would still come up. Like, this comes up in every single panel I'm ever on, regardless of the topic. And it's really important to acknowledge that, because the reason it comes up, no matter how far away it is from the topic of the panel, is because everyone is struggling with it. It is the defining question of being an indie. Aside from, the core heart question, which is what do you want to make? The next question is, how the heck do you get someone to buy it? That question never goes away. Sometimes it gets easier to answer. Sometimes it gets harder to answer. But it's always at baseline hard to answer. Nobody has the magic answer. I wish that wasn't the case, but it just depends. It depends on the product, depends on the thing, the platform that you're targeting, depends on time and place. And I think that probably from the perspective of a mental health panel, the most important thing you can say is that, like, you're not going to magically solve it. All you can do is do your best, right? Like, put in an appropriate amount of effort, and then consign yourself to the fact that maybe it will make, maybe it won't, but don't lose sleep over it. Well, any more than you can obviously try not to lose. If you're making, obviously there's certain rules that you can follow to try to like maximize your odds of success. If you're completely ignoring marketing, you're probably screwed. You should probably not be doing that. You should probably have at least one person on your team. In Rami's case, obviously it was him. In his duo, like, there should be at least one person on your team who's thinking often about what can I do to get my game, to promote my game, and to make sure people are aware of it. If no one in your company is thinking about that, you're probably in trouble. If you're making a mobile game, a mobile free-to-play game, there better be at least one person on your team who understands free-to-play metagame design, such that you can make enough money that you can then go acquire users through paid UA, because that's, as far as I can tell, almost certainly the only way to survive when you're making a mobile free-to-play game. If you don't have someone thinking carefully about what the lifetime value of your user is, and have someone who understands how to then take that money from that user and use it to buy ads, that's a problem. You should probably solve that problem. Find someone who you can hire as a consultant or who can teach you how to do that thing, because if you can't do that thing, you're probably going to fail. There are things like that depending on what you're targeting, you should be doing. But once you're doing that thing, it's kind of out of your hands, right? Like I have been, just to give one personal example very briefly, I've been surprised at how little ability anyone in my company has to predict what's going to have traction on Twitter. We're working on a game called Cozy Grove right now. We tweet all kinds of things, static images, animated GIFs, you name it, and none of us has any friggin' idea which one's gonna get 10 likes and which one's gonna get 1,000 likes. And then we see something that got 1,000 likes and we're like, cool, let's do more of that. And we do more of that, and then it doesn't get 1,000 likes. And you're like, what? Like what? So all you can do is try your best. All you can do is just keep putting stuff out there and try not to succumb to imposter syndrome and say, oh, but this one game made by this, cool dude named Oscar, he's every single time he tweets something, he gets 500,000, retweets. Like, how I have to be like that? Like, no, you probably won't be like that. He's probably super lucky.
I think that's kind of the core of David's story. The two parts that I think resonate with me is you can only try your best, which I think is true. The biggest flip side to that is that it doesn't mean that you are responsible for a failure, right? You can only do your best, but if your best isn't good enough, that doesn't mean you are not good enough. It just means that given this wild swirling vortex of possibilities and opportunities, it did not work out, which can happen to literally everybody in our industry. And that is not a personal failure. It is not something that makes you less worthy of a developer. There honestly is no honor or there's no honor in the title of game developer. Like, you're a game developer if you make video games. That's kind of the end of the story. And a lot of people I know struggle with, am I a real developer if I mess up? Am I good enough if I don't make a hit game? Like, yes, you are. You're making video games. It's a super complicated thing that is, not something you do lightly or easily. And the other thing I think that resonates with me is, and it probably, I don't know if that's exactly what he said, but it probably will not work out. Like, for 90%.
I'm really sorry about these filters, guys. I don't know what's going on. I'm so sorry.
we are actually over time here. Rami, do you want to wrap that up?
I'll wrap that up real quick. Yeah. For the majority of choices you make, for the majority of people in the industry, the end result will not be you are now rich and famous and making the hit game that everybody is talking about. I think the biggest goal that you can set yourself that is healthy is to try and make it so that you can make a next thing, hopefully, and also plan your games in such a way that you can make a next thing. Like Dave was saying early on, don't spend all your money from your first game on your second game, because your third game is also a thing that you need to worry about, right? So I found the healthiest way for me to look at things is I'm not making a game, I'm making games in plural, and not all of them are going to be a success, and I'm okay with that. And that took me a long time to get to that part, but it has been the happiest I've been making video games. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for this super important panel. I imagine we could literally talk all day about these subjects, but I think this was super engaging, and thank you so much for having us here to talk about this.